Hi everyone, it's Nini. Welcome to my channel. I focus just on Midwest crime because I'm a Minnesota farmer's daughter. Today we're going to talk about the Chris Coleman case. This case has been heavily compared to the Chris Watts case since the Coleman case occurred first. Some people call him the OG Chris Watts. Both involved seemingly perfect families who had trouble behind the scenes. Both involved a scandalous affair. Both involved a wife and 2 children being murdered. Let's just get into the case. We're going to go to Columbia, Illinois, which is a small suburb across the river from St. Louis, Missouri, and has a population of about 10,000. Chris Coleman was born on March 20th, 1977. His parents, Ron and Connie, were both preachers, so Chris grew up in a very religious home. He was described as a good kid. Connie said he was the quietest of all her sons. After high school, Chris decided to enlist in the Marines, and he worked as a canine handler. In the spring of 1997, when he was 22 years old, he went to a canine training seminar in San Antonio, Texas. It was there that he met 21-year-old Sherry Weiss, who was a military police officer in the Air Force. Sherry was born on July 3rd, 1977, to Donald and Angela in Berwyn, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. Her parents divorced and her dad moved to Largo, Florida, and Sherry attended high school there. Sherry was described as fun, hope in a bottle, and always was able to make her friends laugh. 3 months after meeting, Chris brought Sherry home to his parents in Chester, Illinois. He told his parents that she was just a friend, that he was driving to Chicago. Connie later said, quote, "I wasn't impressed one way or the other. She was just a little blonde-headed girl to me." Ron said his first thought was that Sherry was a, quote, worldly little girl. Chris and Sherry go on to Chicago, and the next day, Chris calls his father Ron and said, "Guess what? We ended up getting married." They would later find out that Sherry was pregnant. Chris's parents thought that Sherry got pregnant on purpose to trap Chris, and they never really cared for Sherry. Ron even said in later interviews that the only reason the two did get married was because Sherry was pregnant. Sherry was raised Catholic, so that did bring a little bit of conflict because Chris and his family were not, but Sherry embraced his religion because it was so important to Chris and his family. On April 30th, 1998, their son Garrett was born. On January 25th, 2000, a second son would join the family, and this was Gavin. Garrett was described as the more quiet child and a thinker. Gavin was outgoing and a social butterfly. Both played for the Columbia Blue Jay youth football team. They were rambunctious, as little boys can be, but they were polite, respectful, and good-hearted. In 1998, the family moved to Columbia, Illinois, not far from Chris's parents in Chester. They moved there so Chris could start work as a security guard for Joyce Meyer Ministries, which was headquartered in St. Louis. Joyce was a televangelist and had been friends with Chris's parents for years. She even knew Chris when he was a little boy. Chris would eventually be promoted to head of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries and would receive a salary of $100,000 a year. Being head of security made Chris feel important. He apparently shaved his head because he said it made him look cool. Joyce traveled around the country and even out of the country several times a year to preach and hold conferences. As part of her security team, Chris had to travel with her. Sherry stayed home with the boys, and she worked part-time as a receptionist for Destiny Church. She was very dedicated to the church by organizing fundraisers and going on mission trips. From the outside, they looked like the perfect family. Big house on a lake in the suburbs, high salary job, happy marriage, 2 thriving young boys. But that wasn't what was happening behind the scenes. In 2008, the family took a vacation to Florida and visited Tara Lintz, who was Sherry's best friend from high school. Sherry and Tara had been 2 peas in a pod when they were younger. Both were wild and uninhibited. That was how Sherry had been when Chris had first met her. But Sherry had changed over the years and calmed down a little as she became a wife and mother. And as she found religion again, that became very important to her. Tara, however, was the same party girl. She had never married and had no kids. She was working as a cocktail waitress in a gentleman's club. This obviously appealed to Chris because when he was around Tara, she reminded him of how his wife used to be. He wanted to be with that girl, not the more reserved woman that Sherry had become. Not long after that vacation, Chris and Tara began an affair. They lived 16 hours away. Chris was in Illinois, Tara was in Florida, but they made it work. When Chris traveled for work with Joyce Meyer Ministries, he would often fly Tara to wherever he was, and she would hide in his hotel room so the two could spend time together. As the affair went on, Chris's attitudes and behavior started to change. He had always been a very Christian man who followed the rules. He drank, but not a lot. He really didn't swear, and now he drank a lot more heavily, started cursing. Joyce Meyer said that she noticed Chris was not as attentive to his duties. During a work trip to Florida, Chris requested to stay behind for a couple days longer because he wanted to visit some friends. I wonder who he wanted to see in Florida. Even with that large salary, money was tight for the family. It would later be found out that Chris was not only paying to fly Tara to meet him as he traveled, he also let her use their credit cards to pay her bills. But Sherry and Chris's mounting credit card debt could be blamed on both of them. Sherry had a very giving heart and once paid for a friend in need to have their kitchen repainted. She donated a lot of things to homeless shelters, and she also was known to enjoy shopping sprees at the mall. And that really infuriated Chris. He asked a friend, "What would you do if your wife put $1,000 on the credit card at the mall?" He complained that he was working 80 to 90 hours a week protecting a millionaire lady who he didn't even like, while his old lady got to sit at home in a nice big house. On November 14th, 2008, Chris received an email that threatened him and his family. This would be the start of several months of threats. The motive was apparently because of his job with Joyce Meyer Ministries. The emails would say things like Joyce was a fraud, he needed to quit working for her. If he didn't get her to stop preaching, then Chris and his family would be harmed. If they couldn't get to Joyce, they would get to somebody who was close to her. The threats also said that they were watching Chris and time was running out. Nobody else who worked for Joyce reported receiving any threats. In early 2009, when Chris was in Hawaii with Joyce Meyer Ministries, Sherry found a threatening letter in their mailbox. It hadn't come through the mail, it had been directly placed there. This understandably terrified Sherry because that meant whoever was threatening them had been right outside their house on their property. Meanwhile, in Hawaii, Tara had joined Chris and the two were just having a bunch of fun in his hotel room. In April 2009, Chris received the last threat. It said, "I have warned you to stop traveling and to stop carrying on with this fake religious life of stealing people's money. This is my last warning. Your worst nightmare is about to happen." It was then that Chris reported these threats to the police. Justin Barlow was a police detective who happened to live across the street from the Coleman residence. He didn't know Chris well, just in kind of a friendly way that you might know your neighbors. He offered to help out and he set up a surveillance camera in a bedroom window in his house that pointed directly at the Coleman mailbox, hoping to catch whoever was threatening the family. In May of 2009, Chris was 32, Sherry was 31, Garrett had just turned 11, and Gavin was 9. On May 4th, Chris called into work saying that he was sick. This was out of habit for him. Joyce said in 11 years of working for her, she couldn't really remember a time that he had called in sick. On that video surveillance that Justin Barlow had set up, Chris is captured that day playing catch with the boys in the front yard. That evening, Garrett was at a friend's house who lived just 4 houses away, and he asked his friend's mother, Vanessa Regierix, if he and Gavin could spend the night. She said, "Of course, run home, let your parents know, get your things." Garrett ran home, but when he came back, he said that his father had said no, tonight was not a good night, and the boys needed to be back home by 8:30 p.m. Vanessa said that was okay. We'll plan a sleepover for another night and sent the boys home at 8:30 p.m. The next day, May 5th, 2009, Chris woke up and left the house at 5:43 to go to the gym. He called Sherry when he had barely left the driveway, but she didn't answer. He later said he was calling to wake her up. About 40 minutes later, after he was at the gym, he texted her and asked if she was awake. He said he had about 5 minutes of cardio left and then he would be home. Less than 5 minutes after that, that, he sent another text saying, "Hello, are you up? It was time to get the kids up." At about 6:42 a.m., when Chris was driving home from the gym, he called Justin Barlow and said he was trying to get a hold of Sherry to wake her up and she wasn't answering. He was concerned and asked if Justin would go over there and check on them. Justin called for backup and walked over to the Coleman residence. He waited outside the front door until Officer Dagnon arrived. The two of them knocked on the door, but there was no answer. They walked around to the back of the house and saw that a screen had been removed from a basement window and the window was unlocked. Justin called for more backup and then they entered the house through that window. The house was quiet and the basement looked normal. As they walked up the basement stairs, they were hit with a strong odor of spray paint. When they got to the top of the stairs and entered the kitchen, they saw red graffiti spray painted all over the walls, all over the house. It said things like, "I'm always watching," "You have paid," "You knew this was coming." They climbed the stairs to the bedrooms, walking past more graffiti. Officer Dagnon went into the master bedroom, and it was there that he found Sherry lying in her bed, dead. Justin went into one of the boys' rooms and found Gavin also dead in his bed. He then went across the hall to Garrett's room and found that Garrett was also dead. All three of them had been strangled, and that was evident by rope burns on their necks. Justin Barlow said it looked like the boys were just sleeping peacefully, except for the fact that they were gray. It was obvious that Sherry had fought back because she had scratches and a black eye. She also had 2 rope marks on her neck, so she must have been strangled, fought loose, and then was strangled again. Gavin's bed had been spray painted with "you" on it, and some of that spray paint was on Gavin's body. Garrett's bed also had some spray paint on it, but it didn't make out any words, and it almost seemed like the killer had ran out of spray paint when he got to Garrett's room. Both boys were found with a few pieces of Sherry's hair on them, so it was thought that the killer strangled Sherry first, got some of her hair on them, and then transferred it to the boys when they were killed. Chris arrived home about 6:56 a.m. When he was told that his wife and sons were found dead, he didn't ask how they died. He didn't ask to see them. He just walked to the front lawn, sat down, and started crying. First responders were afraid that he was going into shock, so they moved him into the back of their ambulance. It was then that they noticed Chris's arms had a bunch of scratches on them, and when they asked Chris how he got those scratches, he started punching a pillow that was on a gurney, and he said that's where they came from. He would later say that he had got them when he had removed a satellite dish from the roof of their house. At some point after he had gotten home that morning, Chris texted Tara and said he'd call her when he could and he was all right. Police were immediately suspicious of Chris's story because of the condition that the bodies were in. If someone had broken into the house after Chris had left at 5:43 a.m. and committed the murders, the bodies would have been found about an hour after they had been murdered. But the bodies were gray and cold and stiff. They were in algor mortis, which is when the body loses its temperature. And the timing of that can vary based on a lot of things, such as the environmental temperature, body type, if someone's wearing clothing. But the bodies of Sherry and the boys were also in rigor mortis, which is when they become stiff. Jump forward about 20 seconds if you don't want to hear gruesome detail. When Sherry was discovered, she was face down on the bed and one of her legs was bent. When they flipped her over, that leg stayed in that bent position because her body had become stiff at that point. Rigor mortis starts to occur either 2 to 6 hours or 3 to 4 hours after death. It occurs long after the 1 hour that Chris was away from home. Chris was brought to the police station to be interviewed. Justin Barlow would end up being one of the detectives that was assigned the case. Chris was in a tank top and shorts in the interrogation room, and he said that he was cold. Officers brought him a blanket, but he only covered up his arms where those scratches were. When asked if he had seen anything odd that morning, he said the only thing he could think of is that when he was coming out of the driveway, he had to stop for a vehicle that passed by. But when you look at the surveillance footage, when Chris leaves the house, there's no sign of this other car. They asked if he owned red spray paint. He said he didn't think he did, but if he did, it was probably really old. Later on, a red can of spray paint and a glove would be found in the ditch along Interstate 255, which was on the route that Chris took took from his home to the gym that made police think maybe he was trying to get rid of evidence and ditched it on his way to the gym. A detective who looked into Chris's credit card transactions found a receipt from February 9th, 2009 that showed Chris buying a can of red spray paint. Chris's father, Ron, said that Chris bought that spray paint so he could make a bullseye target for the boys to practice on. And he thinks whoever broke into the house that morning just happened to find that spray paint and then used it. A handwriting analysis would show similarities in Chris's handwriting and in the handwriting of the graffiti. Ron and Chris both pointed out that if you use that much spray paint, you're gonna get some of it on you. Chris had been checked thoroughly and no spray paint residue was found on him. But a glove had been found with the spray paint. So if he was wearing gloves, that would obviously protect your hands. He easily could have changed clothes. As the This Is Monsters channel pointed out in their video on this case, Chris went to the gym after he left the house. Most gyms have showers, so Chris could have showered at the gym and gotten rid of any evidence of spray paint that was on his body. I think he also could have showered at his house before he went to the gym. Detectives asked Chris about family finances. He said they were great. He made $100,000 a year. He said Sherry didn't have to work, but she enjoyed it, so he let her. He told them the family was planning this big family vacation to Disneyland, but that was all a lie. Like I talked about, they had massive credit card debt. And also, Chris had canceled that family vacation to Disneyland and booked a cruise to the Virgin Islands that he was planning to take Tara on. Detectives asked Chris if he was having an affair. That's usually a common question when a spouse is found murdered. He said no, but they would find conversations that he had had with Tara, who was a really good friend. Detectives asked if he had done anything with Tara that his wife wouldn't approve of. He said no, but some of the conversations could possibly be interpreted in a bad way. He said he could never have an affair because he couldn't do that to his boys. As Chris is being interviewed, police contact Florida police and they have them quickly go talk to Tara. Tara does confirm the affair, so they hurry up and get back to the police who are interrogating Chris and say, yes, we believe Tara is his girlfriend. So then the police go back into the interrogation room and confront Chris. Chris said he didn't consider it an affair because, quote, an affair is when you are living with them and are going to get married and everything, end quote. When Chris was being interviewed by the police, he texted Tara.
I got a text. I know. You know that. He texted me. I just thought I'd tell you. He
texted us, yeah. What do you want now?
Just said he was thinking about me and that the wake was at 3 tomorrow.
When his computer is looked into, police found strong evidence that supported the affair. There were several pictures of Chris and Tara of an adult nature.
Are you with me so far?
There was a video of Chris naked telling Tara, quote, just got finished texting you and I've still got a heart on. Wanna see it? And then he giggles.
We are in Hawaii.
Sweet daddy.
Being bad. My own home video of naked Tara.
There was another video of Chris self-servicing himself as he said he was thinking of Tara.
So anyway, just wanted to say I love you, and as you can hear, what's funny is you are messaging me now. Said, show me your picture, say I love my hair today. Look at you, you look so hot.
Tara said that the affair with Chris started in late November 2008. When Chris finally would confess to the affair, he said yes, it did start in November of 2008. Police told Chris that they had ways of determining times of death based on the conditions of bodies. And Chris was asked if he was sure they were alive when he left the house. And Chris said, I think they were.
When you left the house this morning, was your wife alive?
Oh, yeah. That's right.
What would you say if I told you that I don't think she was?
I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I think she was.
At the memorial service, Chris texted Tara to let her know that he missed her. People had set up a memorial on the front lawn of the Coleman house. It had stuffed animals, flowers, footballs. The boys loved Legos. Somebody had made a lady and 2 little boys out of Legos and placed it on the front lawn with a message that said, now you're in heaven with your mommy. The day after the funeral, Chris picked up everything and threw it in the trash. 2 weeks after the murders, forensic pathologist Michael Baden concluded his own investigation on the bodies and told police that Sherry and the boys were killed definitely before 5 a.m. and probably before 3 a.m. Time of death was estimated to be between 11 p.m. on May 4th and 3 a.m. on May 5th. Chris's phone had connected to the internet at 2:47 a.m., so investigators believe he was awake and killing his family around that time. With that info and other evidence, Chris was arrested on May 19th and charged with the murders of his wife and 2 sons. He pled not guilty and insisted someone broke into the house and that it was related to those threats that he had received. When authorities looked into the threats that Chris had received, they noticed the email address they had come from was destroychris@gmail.com. The Gmail account had been set up just 20 minutes prior to when Chris received the first email. When they looked into the IP address, it was the same IP address that Chris used for his work laptop. They also compared the wording used in the threats to known emails that Chris had typed, and they noticed some similarities. He would combine words, like instead of typing out set up, he would type out setup as one word. He would put the apostrophe on the outside of the T. So like if he said don't, it would be DONT apostrophe. And the word opportunity was misspelled the same way. Chris said he owned 2 laptops. One he took everywhere he went. The other one sometimes was left at home or it was left in the office. And that was the laptop that the emails had come from. He was claiming somebody else must have accessed his laptop and then sent the threats. But that laptop was password protected. So when claiming someone else had physically got on his computer and sent him the threats didn't work, Chris tried saying that somebody remotely hacked into his computer and was able to send him the emails. A forensic tech would testify that it's impossible to hack into a laptop when it is turned off. There was loads of evidence that pointed at Chris as being the person who killed Sherry and the boys and didn't support that somebody had broken into the house and committed the murders. The basement window they felt was staged to look like a break-in, but not in a very smart way because the screen had been removed and the window was just unlocked. There wasn't a lot of DNA found in the house that didn't belong to the family members. Chris contacting Sherry that morning to wake her up was not a routine thing. When they looked into Chris's phone records, they saw that this did not occur on a regular basis. Plus, that first call to Sherry was when he had barely left the house. So why wouldn't he have just woken her up when he was in the house? There was the evidence of Chris buying the spray paint. An orange twine was found in Chris's gym bag that matched the thickness of the rope marks that were on the necks of his family. In the months prior to the murder, Chris and Sherry's marriage seemed happy to outsiders, but people who knew them closely knew that they were struggling. A friend testified that in January of 2009, Sherry had told her that she and Chris had had sex, which was very rare for them, and afterwards Chris told her, "Don't think this means I love you." Sherry texted friends saying that Chris had wanted a divorce and that he said she and the kids were ruining his career. Sherry even knew of the affair. That didn't surprise me. One of the biggest flaws in shitty men is that they think women are not as smart as them. Women's intuition is very, very strong. When a friend was visiting Sherry, she opened her laptop and said, "Do you want to see a picture of the woman my husband is having an affair with?" and showed that friend a Facebook picture of Tara. Sherry told friends that she had told Chris that she would never divorce him. She would never leave him. She didn't want to give up on their marriage. One of the most eerie things is that Sherry told her friend Kathy LaPlante if she died, Chris had killed her. Chris talked to Joyce Meyer in the fall of 2008 and said they were having marriage problems. He said that Sherry was controlling and they just weren't happy. So Joyce suggested that the two see a marriage counselor, but Sherry told a friend that Chris would put on this fake face while they were in the counseling sessions, but the second they got home, he would treat her like shit and say things like, "I never loved you." A couple weeks before the murders, Sherry and Chris were hanging out with friends. Sherry asked Chris to get her another beer, and Chris snapped at her and said, "Get up off your ass and get it yourself, you lazy bitch." Vanessa Rigorix was there that night, and she said in 5 years of knowing the couple, she had never heard Chris talk to Sherry like that. Chris told police that at the time of the murders, his relationship with his wife was good. Chris claimed he had been trying to end the affair with Tara, but it certainly didn't seem to be that way. Chris actually seemed kind of obsessed with Tara. Police found a document on Chris's computer where he wrote that Tara had changed his life on November 5th, 2008. That was just 9 days before he received the first threatening email. They also found a document that Chris had kept of details on Tara, like her favorite things. He wrote down her eye color for some reason and her height, jean size, her bra and panty size. He had written down that if they had a daughter together, they would name her Zoe Lynn. Tara had apparently been putting pressure on Chris to divorce Sherry, and he told Tara that he was planning to serve Sherry divorce papers on either May 4th or May 5th, 2009. The murders occurred on May 5th, 2009. Chris and Tara gave each other promise rings like they were 16 or something. They talked about getting married in January of 2010. Chris would later say that he had lied to Tara about wanting to divorce Sherry and marry her. Chris's parents still felt their son was innocent. Even after he confessed to having an affair, these two ultra-religious preachers did not think it was that big of a deal. Chris's dad even said this brilliance in an interview.
Tara was just meeting a need that Sherry at the time wasn't taken care of.
But I don't understand.
Well, I mean, every man's got his desires and every man has to be respected. It's built into every man. If your wife doesn't respect you, then you're going to find respect someplace else.
So are you saying that Sherry was a bad wife?
Just at that short, brief time, she had stepped back from doing her job as a wife.
What a jackass. Is that not one of the most disgusting things you've ever heard? Blaming a dead woman for her husband's affair. Police apparently found one of those racy pictures of Tara on Ron's computer. That immediately made me think of Josh and Steve Powell. The motive for Chris killing his family was obviously because he wanted to be with Tara, but also Chris thought he would be fired if he divorced Sherry. But Joyce Meyer testified and said a divorce wouldn't necessarily have led to Chris being fired, but the affair would have.
We have many people that work for us that have been divorced, and a person is not necessarily, do they lose their job because they get a divorce. It wouldn't have been the divorce so much as the immorality.
So for instance, if a person in your employment, if their spouse filed for divorce against them, and perhaps they had little control over that, you might leave them in your employment. That's a possibility.
Certainly.
Okay, and on the other end of the spectrum, if a person was having an adulterous affair and then filed for divorce from their spouse to be with that person, then their employment may have been terminated.
May have been, yes.
The trial began on April 25th, 2011. Forensic pathologist Michael Baden testified and talked again about how he felt the murders had to have occurred prior to 5 a.m. Chris later said in an interview with Crime Watch Daily that according to his calculations. So ignore the doctor pathologist who went to school for 8 years and has been working in the field for like 20 years. Ignore that. But listen to me, who has worked as a security guard for 11 years. That makes me an authority on the time of death. Chris said according to his calculations, time of death occurred at 5:47 a.m., conveniently 4 minutes after Chris had left the house.
As the body has deceased, it's at the body's normal temperature, and then as it cools down to room temperature, the rate that it cools slows down. And so you find that window, and then you work backwards. If you actually use the slowest temperature that was recorded, it actually comes back to 5:47 in the morning is the time of the deceased.
When Baden was testifying, he also talked about how personal it is to strangle somebody. It's not quick. It takes on average about 5 minutes to murder somebody that way. Sherry and the boys were strangled with rope, so whoever had killed them had held that rope on their neck for 5 minutes and had done that with each of them. Some DNA had been found under Sherry's fingernails. That DNA came back as a partial match to Chris. It was not enough to say it definitely came from him, but it was somebody who had a similar profile as him. And remember, Chris had scratches on his arms that morning. In his closing argument, the prosecutor said, quote, "When the killer went to each of those little boys' rooms in turn, and when the killer sat down on their beds, and when the killer reached for them to strangle them, they didn't get up and run. They didn't scream. Of course they didn't. Why would they? It was just Dad." That's heartbreaking. The jury deliberated for 15 hours. The initial vote that they took came back as 7-5 in favor of not guilty. Jurors said that they did believe Chris had committed the murders, but they didn't believe the evidence proved beyond a reasonable doubt that he was the murderer. So they sit back down to look at the evidence again. One of the jurors picks up one of the pictures of Chris and Tara kissing, and she's looking at it, and then she flips it over onto the back, and she can see the printout on it. And it said that the picture was taken in October of 2008. Chris and Tara had both said the affair did not start until November of 2008. That juror said this was black and white evidence right in front of me that Chris was lying. And if he's lying about when the affair started, he was probably lying about murdering his family. I honestly don't necessarily agree with that thinking, because I think you can lie about one thing and not necessarily lie about something else. When they re-voted, they unanimously voted guilty on all 3 charges. That verdict was delivered on May 5th, 2011, exactly 2 years after the murders. Chris was sentenced to life in prison with no parole. I'm going to talk a little bit about a controversial theory. John A. Cameron is a retired detective who believes that serial killer Edward Wayne Edwards is responsible for the murders of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin. He wrote this long document about why he thinks Edwards is responsible for the murders. When I say long, I mean long. 67 pages. Lost a chunk of my Saturday on that. He claims Edwards started killing people in Illinois in 1945. But was not arrested for any murder until July of 2009, 2 months after the Coleman murders. He was 76 in 2009. He is estimated, per Detective Cameron, to have murdered about 500 people across several states. He calls Edwards a psychopath and a genius, which is why it took so long for him to be arrested for murder. Detective Cameron not only feels that Edwards is responsible for the murders of the Coleman family, but that he's also the Zodiac killer. He's the lipstick killer of Chicago, and he killed the Black Dahlia and John Benet Ramsey. Pretty strong claims. Edwards was known to either spray paint or use another method to leave writings on walls in places where he murdered people, or he would leave ransom notes. These writings would usually have a cryptic message encoded in them, which was very heavy in the Zodiac killer case. He frequently set up innocent men for his crimes. He published a book in 1972. He started getting familiar with computers in 1968 and eventually became a computer whiz and was able to hack into pretty much any computer system. Detective Cameron feels there are hidden messages in the spray paint in the Coleman residence that link the killings to Edwards. Like in the "You have paid" that was on the staircase, he feels it was a message about the Black Dahlia because the letters LDAHIA can be pulled from the writing. Liber 777 was a book written by Aleister Crowley in 1903, and it was this satanic religion that Edwards followed. And the message on the Coleman's wall that said, "I saw you leave," Cameron thinks there are 3 sevens in it, which was a reference to that Liber 777. He also thinks you can see the name Edward W. Edwards in mirrored letters in the graffiti as a kind of signature. Detective Cameron thinks the Colemans were targeted because in Edwards' 1972 book, he talked about a Paulette Coleman who was a typist who helped him type up the book. According to Cameron, Edwards wanted to kill somebody with the same last name as Coleman in order to link it to his book. His mother's last name was also Myers, and Chris worked for Joyce Meyer. Some of it is kind of grasping at straws, in my opinion, because it's like, if you mirror it and then take this and move it here and jumble this over here, it spells out something. It's not clear cut, in my opinion. The most interesting part I read was when Detective Cameron compared the letter E that was in the spray paint in the Coleman residence to the letter E that was left on a wall in one of the Chicago lipstick murders in 1945. That killer used lipstick to write messages on the walls of his victims, hence the name Lipstick Killer. The E's do look very similar to me. William Hirons was convicted of the lipstick killings in 1946, but Cameron claims Edwards is the real lipstick killer, and Edwards framed Hirons. A flaw to the theory that Edwards killed Sherry and the boys is that time of death. The time of death for all three was again determined to be between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. If Edwards had killed them after Chris had left the house at 5:43, that doesn't line up. Detective Cameron thinks that Edwards sprayed air duster on the bodies. If you were cleaning out your computer keyboard, that kind of aerosol spray, he thinks he sprayed the bodies with that. There was a can of that air duster found in the basement of the Coleman residence. This would have made the bodies colder and speed up rigor mortis and make the deaths appear as though they had occurred earlier. Cameron's theory, like I said, is controversial. It was interesting to read, but I don't believe Edwards killed Sherry and the boys. There's just so much evidence against Chris, and so much evidence of Chris lying about things, like saying he had to stop for a car when he was leaving the driveway, but there's no sign of a car in video surveillance. Edwards would have had to know a lot about the family in order to frame Chris for the murders. Like, he would have had to known that Chris was leaving for the gym that morning. He would have needed to know the route that Chris was taking to the gym so that he could plant that spray paint and glove to make it look like Chris had gotten rid of it on his way to the gym. He would have had to know about the affair, which would have further made Chris look guilty. Cameron got some of the facts incorrect. Like, he had said Chris had a habit of always calling his wife to wake her up in the morning. That's not true, because police looked into phone records and they couldn't find that Chris did that on a regular basis. And this could just be a minor detail, but Detective Cameron said Chris left the house at 5:37 a.m., but Chris actually left at 5:43 a.m. I want to talk about the similarities between the Chris Coleman case and the Chris Watts case. The most obvious one is that they're both named Chris. Their fathers are both named Ron, though I think Chris's dad goes by Ronnie. Both were married with 2 young kids. Both were having an affair. Coleman had 2 sons and talked about having a daughter with Tara. Watts had 2 girls and talked about having a boy with his mistress, Nicole Kessinger. Coleman strangled all 3 of his family members. Watts choked his wife and then smothered his daughters. All the deaths in both cases were very personal ones. Chris Coleman and Chris Watts were both in their early 30s at the time of the murders. They've either both appealed or are trying to get a new trial. Both parents claim their son is innocent, and both are currently held in the Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. Dodge is a maximum security prison and is better equipped to handle high-profile cases. Ed Gein was also kept there when the facility was under a different name. There's a lot of suspicion in the Chris Watts case that Nicole Kessinger either knew he was planning the murders or was directly involved in the murders. When people look at the neighbor security footage that shows Chris loading the body of his wife into his pickup and then loading up his daughters into the pickup, side note, if you've seen that, that is one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever seen, because you can see in the video a shadow who they believe is Bella coming out and walking towards her father, and him bending down and picking her up and putting her in the pickup. And that's just heartbreaking, because you know what happens about 45 minutes later. To just have that kind of trust to run towards your father, that trust and that innocence, it just is shattered. But in that surveillance video, some people claim to see a light in the front passenger seat of the pickup that is evidence that a second person was opening the door while Chris was in another location. Some also claim to see headlights down the street of a second car. But in the Coleman case, Tara was definitely not directly involved with the murders because she was 1,000 miles away in Florida that morning and she had a solid alibi. But I do wonder if she knew what was going to happen. In one of her interviews with the police directly after the murders, when she tells them that Chris had just texted her, she's laughing.
I got a text. I know. You know that.
And she's very casual. I know if you're stressed and nervous, people have their own ways of dealing with things, but I would think you would be devastated in that moment to find out that 3 people have been murdered and your boyfriend is the suspect. I don't think anything would make me laugh in that moment. I think it's fair to say that even though she knew Sherry, she didn't care about her feelings because she was sleeping with her husband. But I would think if the man you talked about marrying and wanted to have a daughter with could possibly have murdered people, I don't think that's a laughing matter. And I do want to be clear that Chris was definitely the person who was more in the wrong when it came to the affair. Tara did know that he was married, and it can be easy to blame the other woman, but Chris had taken vows, and he was breaking those vows. He had children. He was definitely more in the wrong, in my opinion. A question that I still have is who put the threatening letter in the mailbox when both Chris and Tara were in Hawaii? Chris told Crime Watch Daily he had set up his own home surveillance prior to when Justin Barlow had set up his. And on that surveillance, he had captured somebody dressed in a hoodie, walking up to the mailbox and putting something in it. But before he could remember to download the footage and show it to police, it was erased. Remember, this was a person who was head of security for a big organization. So I wonder, before Tara went to Hawaii, did she fly to St. Louis first and then put the letter in and then flew on to Hawaii? Did Chris pay somebody to put the letter in there? That's the only part that doesn't make sense to me. In 2013, Chris filed for post-conviction relief. He felt his lawyers did not do a proper job because they hadn't mentioned during the trial that the DNA that was found under Sherry's fingernails was not a definite match for Chris. He also claimed the date on the back of that photograph that said it was taken in October 2008 and what had been the evidence that pushed the jury to a guilty verdict. He claimed that date was incorrect. A judge reviewed everything but determined Chris had been given a fair trial and the verdict was constitutionally sufficient. Chris still maintains his innocence to this day and claims that somebody broke into the house and murdered his family. Sherry, Gavin, and Garrett had been buried in Chris's hometown of Chester, Illinois. After Chris passes away, he would have been buried right next to them. In 2012, Sherry's family won a lengthy court battle and was granted permission to move Sherry and the boys to her hometown near Chicago. So in December of 2012, the bodies of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin were exhumed and relocated to be closer to Sherry's family. That's all I have for this case. I hate saying things are fascinating when it comes to true crime, but this was definitely a very fascinating one. The Chris Watts case really intrigued me as well. In that case, Shanann was killed first and then the girls were killed. And the evidence seems to be that Sherry was killed first and then the boys were killed. I believe in heaven. What gives a little bit of comfort is knowing that the mothers made it to heaven first so that their mothers were there to welcome them. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.